Psychedelic music, as it's known today, is a direct product of the 1960s counterculture that took psychedelic drug experiences and distilled it into a musical style. But what makes a song psychedelic? We're going to find out here on Pop Goes the 60s. If you've been watching my channel, I've already done a few videos on some psychedelic music and some psychedelic themes, and only to be told that you don't know what psychedelic music is. So one of the things that I didn't do a very good job of is to discuss what criteria I use for judging something as psychedelic. One of the videos I did was the top psychedelic songs of 1966. It started some discussion. I realized after I had done that I really needed to talk about the criteria that I use to call something psychedelic, because I want to do some other videos as well. And I think if we're going to have a discussion on this, it really would be helpful if I not only explain the criteria I use for judging something to be psychedelic, but when anybody leaves their comments, they should do the same, because basically otherwise you get, well, my psychedelic song is more psychedelic than your psychedelic song, which is a lie. I got plenty of that, believe me. So anyway, this is an attempt to just cut them off at the knees and bring this discussion to a little higher level. So let's start off with what the word psychedelic even means. Of, relating to, or being drugs such as LSD capable of producing abnormal psychic effects such as hallucinations and sometimes psychotic states. Second definition was imitating, suggestive of, or reproducing effects such as distorted or bizarre images or sounds resembling those produced by psychedelic drugs. And third, being of the period of the mid to late 60s that associated with psychedelic drug culture. Psychedelic music didn't begin in the 1960s. The traces of it go back into the probably early to mid 1800s. But I think it's safe to say that it entered the mainstream in the 1960s in a very big way. There is psychedelic music being made today. It has been all this time, since the 60s. Bands like Tame Impala or King Gizzard and the Wizard Lizard, those are some of the today's psychedelic music, which I listen to a little bit of that, but I don't find it anywhere near what I'm talking about in the 1960s. It seems completely different, though it may be inspired by. My first criteria that I'm going to bring up here is more of a parameter as much of it as it is a piece of criteria, and that is I'm confining the discussion to music from the decade of the 1960s. Because once you start getting into the 80s or the 2000s, start talking about psychedelic being made then, it takes on an entirely different meaning. And in the 60s, it took on a meaning all of its own. There was a lot going on, and these things overlapped one another and helped create the psychedelic music scene. My second criteria is an easy one, and this has to do with lyrics. And the example I would use would be White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane.
And the ones that mother gives you don't do anything.
While they're talking, obviously, about a hallucinogenic trip there, because that is from Lewis Carroll, which is very surreal. Now, let's face it, psychedelic music in general is probably the most subjective topic to discuss in music, because it's so subjective and people have such a different way of approaching it. An example of this would be, some people are very enamored with describing Bob Dylan's lyrics as psychedelic. And this is a trend I've seen happening for a number of years. And the song that has been brought up in print a couple of times has been Visions of Johanna. And I'm going to talk about this a little later, but I just think that Dylan's work is very literary, and he plays his lyrics pretty close to the vest. He doesn't explain what his lyrics are, so that leaves it open to interpretation for us. Okay, the next parameter, or the next criteria I'm using, is production style. Now, we saw producers start to get into the business of making special and unique sounds during this time period. And backwards tapes, studio trickery. I just did a video series on the Small Faces, and one of the songs that they did, called Itchy Coo Park, used something on the drums called it goes by a couple of different names. Phase changing is one name. Another, I was corrected by another viewer, they called it flanging. Anyway, it's an echoey, delayed sound on the drums that sounds ethereal and very trippy, for lack of a better word. So those are the kind of things that started to affect music. It wasn't just the lyric writing, but it was also the production style and the advancement of production techniques as well, because you had, prior to the Beatles, you typically had older men in white lab coats in production studios. Well, that changed as the 60s progressed. You had younger people entering that had fresher ideas that were part of this counterculture in a sense. So they brought a different perspective to music production.
My Santa Claus.
So the fourth one I've got here is non-conformist themes. So before the Beatles, and even in early Beatles stuff, you had The Boy Meets Girl, you had Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, you had The Wanderer, you had even Elvis's stuff is pretty straightforward. In the mid-60s, when the psychedelic era came about, you had a change of themes. One of these songs would be Mother's Little Helper by the Rolling Stones. That is a song about amphetamines.
She's not really ill. There's a little yellow pill. She goes running for the shelter. Shiny, shiny, shiny boots of leather.
So that was a different theme that we weren't used to hearing. So the time period of the 60s, you had this counterculture and the ascendancy of the underground. Let's define the underground. Well, you had this anti-war movement. You had a hippie movement, which was a little bit different than the anti-war movement, but there was a lot of overlapping. You had civil rights. You had all these things that were bucking the trends, that were bucking society's norms. And this was ripe for experimentation in music. And not only was it ripe, but it was preferred amongst this group of people. They took delight in upsetting the apple cart. And we see this in music, and we see the musicians that were really pushing the boundaries were doing this, and they used drugs as a catalyst.
Look what's happening up the streets, got a revolution. Hey, I'm dancing down the street, got a revolution.
Those songs started to take on a psychedelic feel. And if you played those songs now, those get thrown into a psychedelic category, even though the theme may be war, anti-war. For some reason, if you listen to any psychedelic radio, you're going to find those type of songs among the playlists.
Smile on your brother, everybody get together. Try to love one another.
This whole love generation was partly spawned from using psychedelic drugs. Instrumentation. So it's no accident that the psychedelic movement really progressed as the guitar players progressed. So the guitar was probably the most identifiable rock instrument, and in the 60s with the psychedelic movement we saw guitars being used to very strange effect, notably by Jimi Hendrix, taking it to places that had never been before. Guitar players challenging themselves to create new sounds. And not just guitar, but this happened with keyboards and, I mentioned earlier, with drums, any instrument imaginable. It was put through filters, it was manipulated and tried to make sound different. Many of the songs created during this time were created with the intent that you would listen to them while on drugs, while stoned. And then it also became normal to go to concerts and to listen to this type of music stoned as well. I'll get to that in a moment. So the instrumentation didn't really stop at guitars, keyboards, and the normal drums, but new instruments started being brought into pop music, Indian music, the sitar, the tabla, tambura. All of this Hindu type of religion started infiltrating the counterculture as well, and the instrumentation was brought along with it. Now the Beatles obviously were very big in promoting that, and that was very apparent on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. They went to India, so there was this whole meditation thing that came along with this that bucked the trend of conventional religion. Hinduism became very much in vogue, And this creeped into the music. This also became a psychedelic cliche, essentially. And very quickly, these musical instrumentations and became fads and trends in the industry, and everybody started to jump on the bandwagon.
But the good love you gave me, I try like a baby. Living without you.
Number 7, psychedelic music evokes feelings of entrancement. There's a lot of music that you can tell they're trying to set up a situation where it's a contemplative listening experience. Those type of colorful images that a lot of people saw when they went on these acid trips or other kinds of hallucinogenic trips, and they tried to transform that and put that into the music, not just the lyrics, but into the instrumentation as well. Number 8, I have, was the composer under the influence? Some people claim songs are psychedelic because they know that the composer had been taking drugs of a certain kind, and that helped render this song. Now, I don't know if that's a good criteria or not, but I've heard that used on me, where people suggest, well, hey, and this is getting back to Bob Dylan, by the way, and Visions of Johanna. One of the reasons some people think that song's psychedelic is they claim that he was going through a heroin habit during that time, and that song was written under the influence of heroin. I don't know if that's true, but I've seen that repeated several times.
Inside the museum, infinity goes up on trial.
But I don't know if that's a good enough criteria to constitute a psychedelic song. I mean, I'm gonna be talking about some of Dylan's lyrics in another video up in this, eventually on this channel. And that's one of the things I like to address, because it's really hard interpreting some of Dylan's lyrics, and it's kind of dangerous to give it too much weight in the psychedelic realm. And we could talk about that. I find some of his songs psychedelic personally, but not a whole lot. Now, number 9 here, this is my last number. Thank you for bearing with me. Number 9 is the listener under the influence. So this is an interesting one, because I've had people tell me there's kind of a snobbery that goes along with drug taking as well. Like, well, if you haven't taken drugs or this kind of drug and listen to the music while you're under the influence, then you just don't get it. You're not going to find it psychedelic. You're not going to find it the way it is supposed to be found. And I find that very, very patronizing to say that, because it's really, I mean, who's to say? You know, I think that the music should stand on its own, whether you're loaded or not. And I think this is one of the things I don't like about psychedelic music, whereby, and this started largely in the mainstream in San Francisco, where you would go to the Avalon Ballroom on the Fillmore, and you'd see these bands that were trying to, these type of jam bands like the Dead and the Airplane and others that were playing to a stone crowd. And you play music differently when you do that. And I think that this started the trend of going to concerts and getting loaded and getting wrecked. It happens still to this day. That some people, whether it's booze or whatever, I think that takes away from the music listening experience. And I think the music should stand on its own, regardless if the listener is stoned or not. So that's a criteria that's been, again, used on me, and I don't know. I'd be interested to see what you think. One of the early psychedelic bands were called the Charlatans, another San Francisco band, and they cut their teeth at the Red Dog Saloon, which I believe was in Nevada. This was in summer of '65, and LSD was being taken during their shows. Now, they weren't a particularly good band. They played more jug band, folky, folk rock, blues. And the experiences people had there made its way back to San Francisco. It was a fun time. And that's one of the things that started the combination of LSD and the jam band.
If that train don't stop and turn around, I'm Alabama bound.
I'd like to share an experience I had once. Came home about midnight to an empty house, and I put some music on. And in the CD player, I had Booker T and the MGs. And this was their album from 1967. Forget the name. But the song on there that was playing was called Ode to Billy Joe. Now that song was done by Bobby Gentry. Many of you probably know it. Not considered a psychedelic song by many, I assume. But Booker T and the MGs, the way they do this song, they slow it down so much. It was very, very pleasing and hit me at the right time. And I stopped and listened to this song. I'm like, this really is hitting me in a different way. And it felt psychedelic to me. And to this day, I consider that song a psychedelic treatment of the Ode to Billy Joe. Now, that's a personal experience I had, not under the influence, by the way, but I can see that happening to a lot of people with a lot of different songs. So some of this stuff does get very personal, but I think that it's still fun to talk about because it does hit certain people certain ways, and the literary part of it really can be taken into a very interesting discussion. So that was 9 different things. I was trying to get a top 10, but I just couldn't get to the 10th one. So you guys out there watching this, feel free to add a 10th criteria to my list. I'd be interested to hear your feedback on this topic, and I wanted to do this because I've got some other psychedelic themes coming here on Pop Goes the 60s. So make sure to check back. Thanks for watching.